Hi, hope you're keeping well. I'm Rachel with Patterns and Pixels Canada. And on today's episode, I'm going to finally be finishing my charm quilt. Charm quilts, or one-patch quilts, refer to quilts where they have used the same repeated pattern or size of shape throughout the quilt. With fabric manufacturers starting to produce charm packs, some people have begun to refer to charm quilts as being those quilts that are made with fabric from just one of these charm packs. Charm quilts have a scrappy look that is intended to showcase the different types of fabric, the different patterns on the fabric, rather than the overall design of the quilt itself. For many quilters, they can look at their charm quilts and be reminded of their past projects. In my case, I haven't been quilting long enough to have produced a scrap container that was big enough to make a quilt of this size. So I had to rely on donations from members of my guild and different fabric swaps that I attended. This means that for me, my charm quilt reminds me of the generosity of other people because I'm able to look at specific fabrics in my quilt and remember the person who donated them to me. This specific charm quilt challenge was put forward by Threads That Bind in Maxwell. This challenge is just for fun, but we will be putting our quilts on display in May of 2024. There were 3 categories that you could enter under, and I chose category number 2. And I'm actually going to read it here just so that I get it right. I'm using my laptop to read my email because I try very hard not to print anything as much as possible. And I normally read my emails off my phone, but I'm using my phone to film this video. So as I said, I'm entering under Division 2, Classic Charm Quilts. My quilt is to consist of 500 or more different fabrics using one shape only. You may use various sizes of that same shape. The edges of the quilt may have partial shapes where the sides are squared up. No borders or sashing allowed. Binding and backing are not counted as different fabrics. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with the terms, sashing would be strips of fabric that I would put between my blocks. So as an example, if I had decided that I wanted my sashing to be black, it might have fit in between my blocks like this. Probably would have done something a little bit thinner. And it would have gone all throughout my quilt. And then the other term we had in there was borders. Obviously, that would border your quilt. That would be something that would go along around the edges. Neither one of these elements can be included in my quilt. What you see here is effectively what the top is going to look like. There will be a little bit of binding showing around the side once I decide what I'm doing, but that's it. No sashing, no borders, just the charm squares. When I started this project, I knew I wanted to make just a small scrappy quilt or throw for my couch. I also knew that I wanted my repeating shape to be rectangles. So when I began, I just grabbed a piece of graph paper and sketched out a few different block designs that might be suitable for this quilt. And I ended up with a 3-block shape. I'll have one of the larger 4.5 squares, then a small 2.5, and then another 4.5. These 3 blocks are the building blocks of my quilt. They are repeated throughout the entire quilt, but sometimes I turn them so that they're in different orientations. I also designed this quilt with rows 1, 2, and 3 completed first. Then I took those 3 rows and repeated them again and again and again as I came came down the quilt. And the only thing I did was turn the blocks each time I moved them down to make a nice repeating pattern. Because I didn't technically have a pattern for this quilt, I just knew that I was going to be making those same 3 blocks again and again and again. I wasn't sure what size I needed to make. So I have been using this throw as my example. This is one that my mom made ages ago, and it is our current couch throw. It hasn't been on the couch for the last few weeks though, because I've had it in here with me. I've been using this as my basis for how big I'd like my quilt to be. I've also discovered it works as a fantastic cat catcher, because I've been leaving it on the side of my table while I'm working, and the cats, instead of coming over and bothering me, have been going and sitting on the quilt, which is quite handy. Now, using that as my template means that yes, it's good for a couch size throw, but I have far surpassed the 500 different pieces of fabric minimum that we were asked to use. I now have in my scrappy quilt 1,104 different pieces of fabric. I'm sure you've noticed by now that I have an empty space in that top corner where there doesn't appear to be any blocks. The unfinished size of my quilt is 84 inches across and 54 inches down. However, I knew that I was going to be losing some of my sizing in my 1/4 inch seam allowances. So I did a little math and calculated out that I was going to need at least 3 extra blocks in each row so that I would end up at the size of quilt that I want. Now I can't reach up there, but I've put 3 extra blocks into each of my rows. And if you follow that line up, it's just about where that top row has ended. Last night I sewed that row together so that you could see how much fabric you lose in a seam allowance. So that top row is finished. The rest of them still need to be sewed. And once I do that, they will all be that length. I have also figured that I'm going to lose about 1.5 rows this way in all of those seam allowances. If I had the option, I would sew some extra rows so that I'm not losing that. Problem is I am now officially out of fabric. So whatever ends up happening is what's going to happen, because I have no more fabric to make any more blocks, and I don't want to go out and buy any just for the tiny pieces that I need for this quilt. As we're talking about seams, I'd like to mention a few considerations that you might want to have in mind if you choose to make a charm quilt like this. First, I have ironed all of my seams flat. I've got quite a few seams in this quilt, and if I were to iron them just to one side, it adds that little bit more bulk to your quilt as you're sewing. And in this particular design, I'm not going to be nesting any of my seams, and so I'd rather them be flat when I go to put them through the sewing machine. It just makes it easier to sew. I also was careful when I was planning this design to try and not have joins in my blocks that run the full length of the quilt. So as an example, this block overlaps here. Now these two do line up, down to 3, and then I've got a block that overlaps. I wanted to stagger those long seams because I thought that when the final piece came to be quilted, it might be really obvious if I had a long seam running all the way down the quilt. However, looking at my design now, it's very scrappy, very busy, and I don't think anyone would have noticed if I had a long seam running the full length of the quilt. But you don't know until you get it up on the design wall. Now, let me show you exactly how I've decided to sew all of my blocks together into rows. And just like that, the quilt top is finished. Okay, not just like that. Sewing all of the blocks together took me nearly 2 weeks. I did a row and a bit each day. There are a lot of seams in each one of these rows, and I was going very slowly and very carefully because I didn't want one little shift early on in a row to then cause the whole row to slightly lean one way. And so you'll see that I kept stopping and measuring each section to make sure that it was the size it was supposed to be. I also did alternate which way I sewed the seams. So I might have started top down for one, and then the next one I went bottom up to try and make sure that the sewing machine didn't slowly pull my rows into a bit of a curve. On a whole, I'm happy with how it's matched up. When I look at the ends, I'm not going to lose that much fabric at the moment for squaring, which is what I wanted. I didn't want to put all the rows together and find I had one that, for whatever reason, was a lot longer or a lot shorter than the other ones, because then I end up cutting off all that fabric, which defeats the purpose of this quilt. Right now, I've just sewn each row. The rows have not been sewn together yet, so my quilt is still 55 inches top to bottom, but now, side to side, it is only 74 inches, which I believe, if I remember from 2 weeks ago, means I've lost 10 inches on each row just to seam allowance, which is huge. My next step now is to sew each of these rows together. Again, I'm going to go very slowly to make sure that I don't have a wiggle or a wobble in my rows. I'll start at the top and I'll sew from left to right for one row, and then the next row I will do right to left until I've gotten all the way down to the bottom. And I think I'm going to use just about every pin I have to keep these rows straight. I want them to be able to just slide through the sewing machine so that I'm sort of just holding them as they go through. I don't want to be pinching or pulling and causing a stretch to the fabric as it's going through the machine. And the only way for me to make sure that that works is to use a lot of pins. So let's get started with that. Okay, the top is finally finished. It has taken me all day to sew all of the rows together. I kept stopping, checking to make sure that everything was lined up. I used a lot of pins throughout the process just to make sure I didn't pull or shift anything, but it's now finished. My width is still the same. I'm still working at 75 inches, I think I said. But my height is now different. It had started out at 55 inches before I sewed the rows together. I'm now at 49 inches. So I lost 6 inches just in the seam allowance alone. I don't know whether or not I'm okay with the size of this top. Like I said previously, I don't have a pattern for this. I'm just kind of winging it as I go along. For those of you that watched my first video, the sewing room tour, and if you haven't, I'll link it in the description below. But for those of you who did watch it, you know that we're in the middle of renovating. And so I've got 2 rooms downstairs, rather embarrassingly, that are full of all of my sewing material. It's taken me 2 weeks from the beginning of this video to now to get this top pieced. And during that process, I have been opening up some of those boxes, and I have since found more of my scrap fabric, which means I do have enough now that I could extend this quilt if I need to, but I'm not sure whether or not I do. I'd said previously that I had been using the quilt that my mom had sewn for the couch as my rough outline for the sizing of this one. So I think what I'm going to do next is find a space on the floor, spread this one out, put this one on top of it, and use that to kind of gauge if I'm happy with the size of the quilt. We'll see if that works. There you have it. Quilt top is finished. I'm still not sold on the size. Clearly, it's a lot longer than the one my mom made. Mom's is more of a square. But I'm looking at that top edge there. I'm tempted to make mine a bit wider. I don't have the backing for it yet, so I don't feel a particular rush for it. I also know that I'm not displaying this quilt until May of 2024. So I think this will be something that gets put to the side. If I find myself of an afternoon with some free time and I want to make a few more blocks, I might do it just to make it a little bit wider. I might actually take it down to my couch as well and sit with it, use it sort of like a, a couch blanket, even though it's not finished, just to see how I feel about the size. But other than that, I'm calling this charm quilt finished. If you've enjoyed my video and you'd like to see some more of the work that I do, you know what to do. Hit that like, subscribe, and bell notification to let me know to keep making these videos. Bye.